And thank you for inviting us to this. I have with me here Ben Wizner. And while Ben looks extremely young, he represents a thought and a movement for a free speech that we have all benefited from around the world for nearly a century. So I'd like a round of applause for our guest, Ben Wizner. As you would have seen in your brochures, Ben is a director of the Speech, Privacy and Technology Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. The truth is that all of these, free speech, privacy and technology, may not have been an issue 100 years ago, but already people were thinking about it. And I want to speak to Ben about not just how important it is to preserve these rights, how important it is to work with new technology and understand the dangers of new technology, but how important it is for a journalist to really think about the theory of what it is they do. You know, you've all heard this phrase, somewhere in your school you would have used it in some essay or the other, which says, I may not agree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Does anyone know who said that? Or who's quoted as having said that? Well, it was supposed to be Voltaire. And of course, this is the thought behind which we have seen governments work over the years to try and fit in some kind of, freedom for journalism, for free speech, for people to be able to say what they do. The truth is, then, that the ACLU, and you in particular, have often been accused of defending the indefensible. I want to get to your more famous cases. As we all know, Ben represents Edward Snowden, who you heard yesterday here. But I do want to talk a little bit about the history of the American Civil Liberties Union, which began with the World War I, and began when there was an equal amount of worry about Russia taking over the world, if you like. And why the ACLU felt it was necessary to take up what were really some very, very unpopular causes. I mean, very few people would know, just outside I was telling someone about interviewing you, and he said to me, so he's a leftist, is he? And I said, well, the fact is the ACLU has represented a lot of very far-right organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan. So tell me a little bit about why the ACLU does this.
So first of all, thank you, and thank all of you. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have been included in this event over the last 3 days, and I've learned so much. So to understand what the ACLU is and why it does what it does, it helps to have a kind of simple theory of democracy. So when you ask most people what is democracy, they say democracy is elections. Democracy is letting the people themselves, the majority, decide how they want to be ruled instead of having some individual ruler tell them what to do. The idea behind a constitutional democracy is that that is an incomplete answer. Having elections is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that very often, majorities of people want to do very abusive things to minorities of people. So you have to have some way to protect racial minorities, to protect religious minorities, to protect political minorities from the abuse that they might suffer at the hand of majorities. And this is where the ACLU plants its flag. We plant our flag where electoral democracy is not enough. In 1925, it was the law in many states in America that in a science class, you could not teach the theory of evolution. You could only teach that people were created by God in the current form that they're in.
It's interesting because we had a state education minister say the same thing. He said, I don't care what Western science believes. I didn't descend from an ape.
So it wasn't popular when the ACLU went into a southern state and into a courtroom to defend the right of a public school teacher to teach science. During the Second World War, as all of you will have learned, the American government decided to lock up in prison camps Japanese Americans because the United States was at war with Japan. And it was not popular when the ACLU went to the Supreme Court to defend the constitutional rights of these Japanese Americans during wartime. In the 1970s, when neo-Nazis wanted to march through a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors in Illinois. The ACLU defended their right to have that march, but also participated in a protest against that march. And this, our theory is that if we only defend the people we agree with, there will be nobody there to defend us when people come after those of us who are dissidents and who have unpopular views. And that's basically what the ACLU is. We have this wonderful constitution, but it doesn't enforce itself. You need to have civil society organizations, lawyers, journalists, and others who actually give life to the words of this Constitution.
I think that's a very powerful thought, that if we don't defend those whom we disagree with, who will defend us when it comes to it? And also the idea that democracy cannot just be majoritarian. It cannot just be the rule of the many. Amongst all the cases that you have held, and then the one you've held personally is defending Edward Snowden. Now, this is a man who has been accused. He was not the journalist who broke the story. This is the man who physically stole data from the National Security Agency in America. Give us a sense of why you thought it was necessary to defend him, even as we followed Edward Snowden flying around the world. Was he going to go to Hong Kong? Would he go to Cuba? And eventually he went to one of the countries least known for freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So tell us a little bit about why you took that case.
Here's the way that I think about the role of people like Edward Snowden. As we know, all governments would prefer to decide for themselves what information the public has and what information is kept from them on so-called national security grounds. This is not just the case in authoritarian societies, this is the case in every democracy. That those in power feel that they are the only ones who can legitimately decide what should be secret and what should be public. The problem is that that rationale is too often used not to protect the public from danger, but to protect the powerful from embarrassment and accountability. And so if you look at recent American history and consider, what would we not know if we only knew what the government told us? We wouldn't know that the war in Iraq in 2003 was based on lies and exaggerations. We wouldn't have known that the US set up secret torture prisons around the world and flew foreign citizens there to be held incommunicado and subjected to torture. We wouldn't have known about the unlawful surveillance of Americans and non-Americans around the world. We wouldn't have known that any civilian had ever died in a drone strike. Right? These are things we know because people in government who knew the truth decided to tell reporters so that the public could know, and the public needed to know those things. In the Snowden case, he observed over the course of a decade in the intelligence community that the United States had built an entire global system of mass surveillance, that it was not only hiding from the American public, but when asked about it, it was affirmatively lying. So that when the leaders of the intelligence community went before our Congress and were asked, is there any information that you are collecting on millions or hundreds or millions of Americans, they said no, when the honest answer was yes. And Snowden also saw that the courts were unwilling to publicly intervene in this, that when organizations like mine tried to challenge the legality of these programs, we were told we didn't have legal standing to be in court because we couldn't prove that people like us were being surveilled. So I think it's vitally important. Now, after Snowden came forward, many of these policies changed. So the courts all of a sudden started to say, hey, maybe that's illegal. The Congress, for the first time since the 1970s, passed a law to restrict the surveillance of the intelligence community instead of to expand it. And even President Obama, who is not a friend of Snowden, said, this debate that we're having has made our country stronger.
But it was under President Obama that Snowden was followed and persecuted, if you like, as well. So it means that no matter who is in charge, today we all criticize President Trump for what he's doing, but the fact is no matter who's in charge, there's a system of national security that always prevails.
That often does prevail. I mean, again, it prevailed in one sense here, in the sense that Snowden is forced to live in exile. At this moment, there's only two places in the world where he can be. One is awkwardly living under the protection of the Russian state, and the second would be in a prison cell in the United States serving a life sentence. As between those alternatives, he chooses the first and not the second. On the other hand, his disclosures fundamentally changed the legal and political situation in the United States. Led to real reforms, both in law and in technology. But look, you're right, no government, whether it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government, is going to consider someone like Snowden a hero. They don't want people in his position to decide for themselves what information should be public or not. One other point about this, about Snowden, and then we can move on. Snowden didn't make any information public himself. He could have published the NSA files on the internet. Instead, he decided to work through journalists. And what he said at the time was, I don't have the experience to make the judgments of what the public should see and not see. Journalists have that experience. They've been doing it in our country for 200 years, deciding which government secrets to publish and which ones to conceal. And so his instruction was that the journalists should make their own public interest determinations after consultation with the relevant government agencies about what to publish and what not to publish. And so what he did was really a strong endorsement of the role of journalists as the representatives of the public.
All right, and how does this play out for you personally? Because at the end of the day, you're defending a man who's a fugitive from law in your own country, who's been called a traitor, who has, as you said, has no plans to even come back and face the legal process in the United States. Have you faced threats? Have you faced that kind of criticism yourself?
There's a difference between criticism and threats. For 17 years, I've faced criticism relentlessly, but not threats. Not threats. I mean, we heard yesterday that in 2016, 21 journalists were killed in Afghanistan. In 2017, 16. So far this year, 12. To do the work that I do in the United States is to sit in a very privileged position relative to being a human rights defender in most of the world. And so I certainly get lots of people sending me very nasty messages, either in the mail or over social media, that I love terrorists, that I hate Christians, all kinds of things, that, you know, we're the American Communist Union, not the Civil Liberties Union. But that I can take with a smile, because I know how safe I am, again, compared to people who have to do this work in much more dangerous environments.
Right. Edward Snowden has also moved on to commenting on privacy issues around the world. Yesterday we heard him speak fairly critically of the Indian identity database, what's called the Aadhaar. Do you think what Edward Snowden is putting into place, regardless of whether he faces a case in the US or not, is actually something that the world needs to hear more of? Because there are enough people who are saying, you know, this is scaremongering. The information that you put out on Aadhaar, for example, you give it willingly to buy something off Amazon, and you give a lot of it willingly to get a visa from the United States. So is it scaremongering to be worrying about that kind of data sensitivity?
People like Snowden are not thinking about what these systems are doing today. They're thinking about how they are almost certainly going to be used tomorrow. In 2013, when Edward Snowden introduced himself to the world, he said in this first interview that the United States had built what he called an architecture of oppression. We were still an extremely free society relative to the rest of the world, but we had constructed this architecture. And his concern was that someday a different kind of leader would come along, and he would use war or terrorism as a justification to turn this system back against the American people, to kind of flip a switch. Turnkey tyranny was the term that he used. And at that point, it would be too late to organize real resistance. And people said to him, "You're so paranoid. This sounds like science fiction, not politics." And sure enough, in 2016, Donald Trump was elected president. Now, it so happens that Trump, who is exactly the kind of leader that Snowden was worried about, has not been able to turn that switch. because for very strange reasons, he finds himself at war with the American intelligence community rather than having that community behind him. But if you can think about Trump with 70% popularity instead of 30% popularity, with the CIA and the NSA and the FBI behind him rather than trying to undermine him, then Snowden's prediction would very soon come to pass in the United States. When he talks about a system like ADAR, he's not talking about the rules as they exist today. He's worried about it being converted into a universal identity system that requires you to have a number in order to engage in any kind of transaction in the entire society. So not just to get a birth certificate, but to buy a bottle of milk. A world where there is not cash anymore, but every single thing that you do is comprehensively tracked, so that if you become an opponent of the government, if you become a dissident, if you become someone who the government thinks is a nuisance, it won't be difficult at all for them to reconstruct all of your movements, find out not just what you're doing, but who you're communicating with. So that's what he's thinking about. Is he a scaremonger relative to the situation in 2018? You might think that he is, but I want you to understand, he's talking about 2020, 2025, 2030. What happens when we build a system like this is we're actually making it easy for some future authoritarian leader to turn it against the people.
All right. How bad is it really? Because, you spoke about science fiction, and it's true. Most of us watch, a detective serial on Netflix, and we can see how easy it is for detectives to do face recognition in a crowd and be able to find the criminal. Some would say it's almost important in a modern society for the state to have those kind of tools, because the crime that we see is also pretty awful in modern society. So how bad is it? I mean, you spoke about going to get some milk. I know in certain countries, when you go into a restaurant and you swipe your phone to pay for the bill, you're actually giving a lot of other information, like what you like to eat and who you come with to the state as well.
So one way of thinking about that question is to compare the world about 25 years ago to the world today. About 25 years ago, surveillance by governments was extremely expensive. If the government wanted to know where I was over a period of 3 or 4 or 5 days, they might have to assign teams of police agents working in shifts to follow me over 24 hours. And you've seen this in old movies where the police are sitting in a van with headphones outside a house and drinking coffee. And what that cost meant is that if the government was going to decide to follow me for a few days, there was probably a pretty good reason for it, because they couldn't follow all of us. They had to make decisions. Where are we going to put our police resources? And now, almost every one of you is carrying a police officer in your pocket, right? And what it means now is that technology has made it possible for governments and also corporations, and we can talk about that too, to track and record virtually everything we do, everything we say, where we go, who we communicate with. And that represents a huge shift in the balance of power and rights between individuals and the government. Are there benefits from this? Of course, there are benefits from this. It's a good thing when that kind of technology makes it easier to capture violent criminals who are threatening society, to catch the rapist who has attacked many people. And most people in my community are not saying that surveillance is wrong and that even digital surveillance is wrong. What we're saying is we need a little bit more legal protection. So instead of allowing the government to collect all of this information about where I have been over the last few months, about everyone, they should ask a judge permission. They should go to a judge and say, here's why we think that Ben is involved in possibly illegal conduct, and we want a warrant from you so that we can track his movements over time. They shouldn't be able to just, by default, collect all of that information about all of us, create what I would call a comprehensive surveillance time machine, so that anytime anyone falls under suspicion, they can, without permission from a judge, reconstruct our entire lives. I don't think we're yet in a science fiction dystopia, but I think that we have very casually and sort of blindly watched this architecture get built up around us that could be abused. And for people who say, I'm not worried about this, I really don't have anything to hide anyway, that's obviously not true. You close the door when you use the bathroom or you take a shower. You probably wouldn't publish the passwords for your email accounts and your social media. You make decisions all the time about what you want to share and what you want to keep private.
Yeah, you mentioned the role of corporates. So Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're all under fire today for having shared information that their users have shared with them. The Cambridge Analytica case is well known. Do you think there is a difference between what the corporates are able to collect and what the state collects?
Well, one way in which there isn't a difference is that the state security agencies are getting most of their surveillance information from those companies. So there's never been a more effective surveillance operation than Facebook. No spy agency in the history of the world, including the East German Stasi, had as much information on citizens as Facebook has on all of these citizens. So,
voluntarily given.
Well, that's right, voluntarily given. So sometimes all the FBI or the law enforcement have to do is go to Facebook and ask for the information. But the difference is that governments can lock us up. They can put us in prison. In some cases, they can take our lives. These companies can't do that, at least yet. So it makes sense to have somewhat different legal regimes governing consumer privacy and then governing privacy with respect to the government.
Okay, I had two last questions. The first being, when you turn on the ACLU website, the first thing it says to you is donate monthly to fight Trump's attacks of people's rights. Yeah. When you go further into the site, it also says we have to vote in November like our rights depend on it. Many would accuse you of being very politically partisan and anti the government in power.
I suppose if you put those two sentences together, we're saying vote against Trump, although Trump is not on the ballot in 2018, right? No, this is a tension that exists in lots of NGOs. We are extremely nonpartisan, both by law and by policy. We work with and against all political parties. When Obama was president, all of our work was to push Obama and to sue Obama around his policies. That doesn't mean that all presidents are the same. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore the fact that Trump in some ways is a very unique threat to the Constitution and the rule of law. Not the first time. I became a lawyer at the ACLU when George Bush was president, and he's the one who made torture the official policy of the United States. Trump hasn't done that yet, right? Nonetheless, it's easy to see that Trump has no respect for democracy. The leaders who he respects around the world are Putin, the Chinese president, Duterte in the Philippines, and even long before he was president, he praised the Chinese government for the Tiananmen Square massacre. This is not somebody who fundamentally believes in democracy. And given the opportunity, he's someone who, in a unique way, would undermine American norms and the rule of law. And that's why the membership of my organization has gone from about 500,000 to about 2 million. This is the number of Americans who are giving us money every month or every year to push back, because people recognize...
So actually it's increasing the kind of people who are worried about...
That's right. So that's not to say, I personally think that our website, I agree with you. I think it comes off as being a little bit too partisan. I don't want the identity of the organization to be the resistance to Trump. I don't want the members who join us now to think that when Trump is not president, that human rights won't be important anymore. And I think
won't be challenged.
That's right. So I think it's a delicate balance.
All right. And in terms of India and what we can learn from how you are fighting, because there is a problem for whistleblowers, even though there is a new legislation for whistleblowers here. We have a very famous case of a medical education scam, a scandal in which 35 key witnesses or people involved have died over the course of the investigation. Of those 35, at least 12 died under suspicious circumstances, including some of them being journalists who were covering the scam. We have more recently sting operations that interview people who say we are part of the lynch mobs that beat to death this man. And yes, we will do it again. They're on camera speaking. And so is the person who's interviewed them. These are all great. It's not just, theoretical that there is a threat to journalists and whistleblowers. What sort of lessons you would like to give them or pass on to them?
I'm not sure that someone in my position has a lot to teach here. I think I probably have a little bit more to learn about courage. It's easy for me to say that there's no substitute for conscience and courage, that we will always, in all of our societies, need people who are willing to risk their jobs and sometimes their life to provide information to the public. But I'm saying that from a place where it's extremely rare for journalists or NGO workers or witnesses to actually face the kind of physical violence that people face here. But our democracies depend on it. An earlier speaker said that he believes that democracy is in the blood here. I disagree. Democracy isn't in anybody's blood. Democracy is constantly a fight. It's not something that we inherit. It's a responsibility that we assume. And in some times and in some places, that's meant actually going to war. And in this region, it sometimes means risking your life. But the alternative is to accept a world where injustice is the norm. And I think that the people in this room are not willing to accept that kind of world.
Right. Thanks so much. And democracy is a fight. Democracy is not something that you will just inherit and be able to have and take for granted. I think those are very powerful words. Do we have time for questions, or do we have some time for questions? Yeah, go ahead. Let's just take a few quick questions.
Good morning, this is Mohammed Ali here. My question is there recently I had a conversation, we had a conversation with the former president of Afghanistan, Mr. Hamid Karzai Saab. So he said one very important thing, that we are at, it's not today you talk about that we are in an era that we are fighting for our rights or for the truth. We have always been onto an age where at times comes that a boiling age comes. But it is you to decide that you want to be a catalyst to that particular situation, you want to be a moderator, or you want to be a like in a nuclear plant we have got a coolant, So what do you want to do? That's most important. So according to you, what is the situation like when I compare, when organizations like ISIS kill journalists, openly, and to the situation where, I don't find any sort of difference when journalists are being openly being challenged or are suppressed or are oppressed on to the fact of truth. So what is your take on that?
All right. The truth is that there is no difference, that there are at all times forces that are essentially seeing journalists as the problem. Because getting the message out, which is not convenient for the person who is in charge or the person who is in the establishment, is always going to be, is always going to be seen as a threat. With the ISIS case, it's become more interesting because, when we sort of looked at conflict journalism 20 years ago, the idea was the media was always the bystander. The media was always reporting on what they saw, and actually got a lot of leeway from both parties that were fighting, both from the state and the rebels or whoever was in conflict, simply because it was understood that the media had a job to do. Right? Today, ISIS sees the media as a target and actually as a very convenient hostage to take, so they'll kidnap a journalist because they know that that kidnapping will get worldwide coverage and will get them the oxygen of publicity that they want. But if you look at it in a theoretical way, it's what politicians and leaders around the world are doing to journalists anyway. They're saying journalists are the target. They may not be killing them and, kidnapping them. But that's the kind of atmosphere they want to build. They want to build an atmosphere where they say, journalists are the problem. Take the journalists out. because they're all fake news, because they're all paid media. In our country, we use the word prostitutes. It's a word that is used by a cabinet minister or a minister of state. So you're looking at a situation where around the world, people are talking about take the journalist out. It's no longer, whether the journalist is a bystander or whether it's a catalyzer or whether the journalist actually is a coolant in the situation. It is about making that journalist go away if what he's saying is inconvenient.
Yeah, the only thing I will add in the US context is that we have a president who now openly refers to journalists as the enemies of the people.
That's right.
The enemies of the people. This is incredibly incendiary language, and many publishers have warned the president that very soon this is going to lead to violence against journalists by strong supporters of the president, but he continues to use that kind of language that is pretty close to incitement.
Yeah, right. Do we have time for one last question? Go ahead, sir. Just make sure you have a question, because I think the lady here has shown me time out for a while. Just, can you speak? Oh, sorry, there's someone.
Oh, good afternoon, ma'am. My question is the fact that when we spoke about the United States of America and the age of unenlightenment in modern society, we can realize the fact that the US is the only first world country which has such a great partition in terms of its politics. A lot of people would blame it on the right of apologies, on the First Amendment of free speech, which is widely celebrated in the US but overly exploited. Do you believe Fox News uses this to spread propaganda, and the Republicans bank on this propaganda for further political gains? So where does this cycle stop? Because the only people who can actually pass laws are the Republicans who are in power right now in the Senate, in the Congress, and in the White House, but they won't do so. So where does this cycle stop once and for all?
That's a very important question, because it also has parallels in India. In fact, by coincidence, we have a Fox News-esque channel here that is called The Republic. And the question really, how far does their right to free speech and the right to cover stories extend into blatant propaganda?
I mean, I would turn this question around. If we were to try to institute a regime that said that propaganda is not free speech, who would decide what's propaganda? Now, every day on Twitter, Donald Trump attacks CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, three of the most respected mainstream news organizations in the United States, and calls them fake news. As you say, the Republicans are in power. If we had a rule that propaganda was prohibited, what would the Republicans say is propaganda? Would they say it's Fox News, or would they say it's CNN? And this is the problem, is that we don't have some kind of neutral arbiters who are sitting out there in space who will enforce these laws. The laws are going to be enforced by human beings. And those human beings are not going to be enlightened journalism students or journalists who can easily distinguish between propaganda and not. They're actually going to be the very people in power who are exploiting these forces, and they're going to use it to make the situation worse and not better. And this is why, as much as I despise what goes on talk radio, on Fox News, I would personally defend their right as long as what they're doing is not actually libelous or defamatory, or it doesn't fit into any other narrow exception to the First Amendment.
All right. Thanks so much, Ben, for giving us this very inspiring talk.
Thank you very much.